Thanks, everybody. Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Camilleri. Last year, podcast audiences were riveted by an investigation into the 2005 disappearance of Tara Grimstead. Up and Vanished, created by Payne Lindsey and Donald Albright and hosted by Lindsey, actually ended up leading to the arrests of two suspects 12 years after Miss Grimstead disappeared. Now Lindsey and Albright are back with another crime story, Atlanta Monster, an investigation into the murders and disappearances of up to 30 children from predominantly African-American communities in and around Atlanta, Georgia in the late 70s and early 80s. I'm about 3 episodes in, and like its predecessor, it's impossible to stop listening to. Everyone, please welcome Payne Lindsey and Donald Albright. Give them a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for being here. Before we even talk about Atlanta Monster, I think for those who aren't familiar with Up and Vanished and what happened, take me through what happened in the wake of releasing Up and Vanished and the arrests and what that felt like.
It's a crazy story. It started with the idea that I wanted to make a true crime podcast because I was just an avid listener of true crime podcasts, big fan of Serial. And so I set out to solve a mystery. I found this tragic story in South Georgia. This missing beauty queen and high school teacher named Tara Grimstead had been missing for nearly 12 years, and no one knew what happened to her. Police had no idea. They'd basically given up. The community just didn't know what was going on. And so I started poking around in this small town, and about halfway through the podcast, I was putting out weekly episodes, there was a huge break in the case, and someone came forward and confessed a story that ultimately led to the arrest of 2 individuals. And since then, it's just been a huge story in the media, especially in Georgia. And there's a trial coming up this year for the murder of Tara Grimstead. And Ryan Duke has been indicted for murder, and there was a second person, an accomplice named Bo Dukes, who helped destroy the body. And it's a horrible story, but it brought a lot of closure and answers to this community. And I didn't know what to expect going into it. And I just wanted to tell a story that I thought was important and hopefully make a difference somehow. And it just so happened that it prompted some stuff to happen in the real life case, which was amazing. And so we decided after that to tackle another story. And this is Atlanta Monster is something that you had mentioned to me, and I'd actually never heard of this. This was the early 80s, and I was born in 87. So he actually brought this story to me initially, and it seemed to make sense for us to look into it.
Yeah, I know you want to do something new and something different before we got into season 2 of Up and Vanished. And we want to do something that wasn't a missing persons case. I was just having a conversation with my fiance actually at the time, and we just talked about, we're talking about true crime, and she brought up the Atlanta child murders, something that she grew up in Connecticut, but it still affected her. She knew about it. I grew up in California, 2,000 miles away from where this was happening, and I was only maybe 4 or 5 years old when it was national news in like 1980, 80 to 82, and I just sent Payne a text message and said, "Hey, are you familiar with this case?" And he wasn't familiar with it, and he familiarized himself with the case, and there was so many unanswered questions that he was just compelled to let's find some of these answers. There's so many victims' families that are looking for closure. There has to be something that we can uncover or that we can find out about at least one of these cases that's going to, let some parent sleep a little bit better after almost 40 years of not knowing what happened to their child. So,
can we talk about just how insane it is that you didn't know about this case and that I didn't really know about this case? I mean, I actually consider myself someone who watches and reads a fair amount of material about serial killers in this country. This is potentially 30 kids. And this is an unknown case, and you have to think in some ways that is kind of racially motivated, that we don't know about this case, that it isn't as prevalent in this country as a case where one guy killed 2 women in 1958 or something like that, which we all kind of know about.
Right. There's 2 things at play here. I think there's a generational gap, and I think there's a racial gap. The reason I knew about this like I said, 2,000 miles away, I knew about it, is because I'm black, and this was affecting black children and black families. So if you weren't part of the black community, you didn't have to worry as much that, hey, my child may be at risk, or, your family. Payne's dad actually heard about it, but he didn't, it wasn't something that was kind of passed along generations, where in my family, I knew about it at an age where I probably shouldn't have, and it affected a generation of children, how they were raised. And that's the one thing we discovered just doing this podcast. We talked to locals who told their true story. They grew up in the neighborhoods where these kids were coming up missing from and then later found murdered, and they didn't even realize how much it affected their childhood. And it's something that they will pass down to their kids, and it's something that really affected the Black community more than anyone else. And the generational gap, it's simply that pop culture, they've talked about the Zodiac Killer, Hillside Strangler, but no one is talking about the Atlanta missing and murdered children. And unfortunately, if you're poor and Black in this country, you don't always get the headline. And this is also, it's an uncomfortable case to talk about. No one wants to talk about any issues that are going to divide us, right? So if it's uncomfortable to talk about race issues that are have racial implications, it's definitely uncomfortable to talk about them when it includes murdered children. So I think that those two things play a huge role in why you didn't know about it and why Payne didn't know about it.
Now, Payne, talk to me about what it was like going into this one versus having just finished up the last one, which was by and large, I think, probably a greater success than you could have ever imagined. Not just the amount of listeners, but the fact that someone came forward and 2 people were arrested. When you go into Atlanta Monster, are you looking for a story that could have the same effect, or are you able to kind of ground yourself and be like, I just want to find something that interests me?
It's not just the interest part for me. I'm the kind of person who I don't even like to go into stories as far as the storyteller if I think that the ending is already written, or even watch a TV series. I'm like, oh, we already know who did it. We already know the way this ends. And so from a storytelling standpoint, that was my only drawback. But as I dug into this case and I met these families who were so convinced that Wayne Williams didn't do it, and just seeing the hurt that they've endured because there's never been real closure for them, and some of the new information I was finding, I realized that regardless of whether or not someone's in prison for these crimes, one, he was only convicted of 2 adults, and no one was ever convicted of the murders of the children. And really,
it was just assumed that he had done that, and they closed the case on the children, right?
yes.
So essentially, you do kind of have a cold case file in the way that you did with Tara Grimstead.
Yeah, and the FBI actually has a public file out there for anyone to explore. It's super long. You need a lot of time to do that. But it's thousands of pages, the whole case. And I just realized that there was more information here. There were some doors that we could close. There were some conclusions that we could find and get to that were, important to the real people in this story, and also satisfactory for a listener too, to justify, making this really strong podcast story. And that's what we tried to do. And I was convinced in the beginning this is an important story to tell. Obviously, 1980, I wasn't around, but just looking back at all the archive clips and just seeing all the racial bifurcations back then, it's really interesting to look back and almost reflect on where we were as a country back then and compare it to where we are today. Some things have changed, some things have not changed.
I mean, at the beginning of, I think, the first episode, you have someone say this is only 10 years after the Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah.
This is really starting to take place. And when we talk about the difference of who knows about this and who doesn't know about this and how it's spread over a generation, we're obviously talking about the gatekeepers of media who are pushing these stories out, because the gatekeepers are all predominantly going to be, white people, white executives, white anchors, white reporters. This story gets kind of pushed aside, even though it's one of the most grisly stories I think any city in America has ever faced.
Right.
It definitely is.
Yeah, and I think there's so much more to this story as well. So it's not just about these crimes; it's about the way they were swept under the rug. So this happened in 1980, 15 years removed from civil rights legislation. The city of Atlanta is experiencing a changeover. The first Black mayor, the first Black police chief, and there's this division that's out there, and the city needed to get past this. There's a black eye. They needed to move on. So if you convict Wayne Williams of 2 adult murders, and you leave the other ones open, there's still mass hysteria, and the community is not over this yet. So they needed to get past this, and it's not like there was a rush to judgment on at least half of these cases, if not more. So really looking back into that is something that people don't want to dig up and tell maybe that part of the story, but it's something that we're exploring.
Now, Payne, I realize along with Up and Vanish, you're sort of working on this while you're publishing the podcasts, right? So you're still conducting interviews and you're still talking to people. You have a big one that has come your way that I want to talk to you about in a second. But I'm curious, when do you decide that you have enough material here to follow through and start a whole season of podcasting? Do you sit down and you're like, okay, I think we got it? Or was it the first episode of doing interviews and then you realize you can keep going?
I don't know. It's a tough question to answer because I always feel like there's never going to be enough. At a certain point, you have to just start something, and you have to just decide that we have enough to start this story. And the way I've kind of done the past two podcasts, Up and Vanished and Atlanta Monster, is I got the ball rolling with this story and this backstory, and I'm exploring different people, different ideas, and then halfway through, it kind of hits this real-time moment where someone can call in with a story that changes the whole narrative for the rest of the podcast. And so the door has been left open intentionally for that to happen again. But we've thought out everything. We have 10 episodes slated. Episode 5 comes out tomorrow. So we've put a lot of thought into the overall narrative and story arc here, and we know the different themes that we want to hit on. But at the end of the day, it's also a piece of investigative work here. And so we could find new information that could change everything. And so we left that door open on purpose because we know that a lot of these families never got closure, and any new information at all is helpful for people.
And now you left the door open, and when it comes to episode 5, someone has called you, walked through that door. Do you want to talk about who that person is?
Yeah, so if you haven't heard the podcast, spoiler alert, so just go ahead and say that. But the first couple episodes are spent taking you back to 1980, 1979. What was America like? What was Atlanta like? And then these kids started disappearing, and no one knew what was going on. And then these kids were showing up murdered. And then next thing you know, America and Atlanta is just in this state of paranoia, mass hysteria, that there's a serial killer on the loose. And the FBI gets involved, the GBI, the Atlanta police, and they're all working together.
We're talking 20 to 30 kids here. We're not talking like
a couple.
Talking,
over 20 kids here.
I think someone 30. At one point says bodies were appearing every 10 days.
Yeah.
Yes. It was a huge problem. It was tragic, and they had no clue what was going on. They had to catch somebody. So they set out this Bridge Stakeout plan where they were going to go stake out every bridge in Atlanta because the bodies were showing up in the rivers. And so they would camp out underneath these bridges. They were all hidden, and they did it for 30 days. On the 30th day, the last night of the Bridge Stakeout, one of the recruits down at the bottom heard a loud splash, and he thought it was a body. Never saw the body, but he heard a loud splash. Look up on the bridge, and there was a man named Wayne Williams driving his car there. Ever since that day, Wayne Williams was followed, and he was interrogated, and they built a case against him. Some was based on fiber evidence, and he became the Atlanta child murderer. Now, they only convicted him of 2 adults, but they attributed the rest of the child cases to him.
Because one of the adults they found in the river, 2 days after.
That's correct. So 2 days later, after that
heard.
bridge incident, they found a body downstream.
One of the adult victims that he was ultimately convicted of, yeah.
Now, as I said, you've left the door open and someone has called you and walked in. Can you talk about who that person is for episode 5?
Yeah, so Wayne Williams, the man in prison for these crimes, is just been a mystery for everyone for a very long time. And so in episode 5 that comes out tomorrow, you get to hear him for the first time. For the past 3 months, I've been talking to Wayne behind the scenes, and it's been sometimes nightly, weekly, sometimes multiple times a day. And so I've got to really kind of know who this person is. And I met him through a guy named Dwayne, and he's someone I met online because I saw this video that was of a victim's brother who said he witnessed someone else kill his brother. And I found that obviously intriguing, and so I called this person. Turns out this person knows Wayne Williams and communicates with him every day, and Wayne found out about the podcast, and he said he wants to tell his side of the story. So given that these families are telling me they're not convinced Wayne did it, and after watching this video of this brother telling me he saw someone kill his brother, it wasn't Wayne Williams, I said, okay, let's hear this guy out.
Now, without giving anything away about what's in the episode on Friday, what is it like talking to Wayne Williams?
It's very interesting. He's very polite. He's very charismatic. He's a very fast talker. Part of that could be because he's in prison and he only got 15-minute time slots on the phone. So maybe that's part of it. But to be honest with you, he hasn't really changed that much. If you watch a press conference video of him back in 1980, he sounds the same.
Yeah.
He's, I would say he's intelligent. He's just very interesting. He's very involved. He likes the idea of there being a big story about this for whatever reason.
He does.
He does. He definitely does.
Is that because he thinks that it might be able to exonerate him, or does he just like a big story about him?
I think it's both, to be honest with you. I mean, his job.
Weird. That's fucked up.
Yeah.
Well, his job before this was he was a talent scout, and he was recruiting kids to make these boy bands, and that obviously didn't look very good as the alleged Atlanta child murderer. That was one of the leads they had that they thought that's how he was.
Right. That rarely goes
Grabbing
well
the
for
kid.
anybody
Right.
recruiting boys for boy bands.
Right, and I mean, he's a behind-the-scenes kind of guy, but a guy who does like the attention. Even when he was, he called a press conference in his living room and wouldn't allow the press to show his face, but half the press conference was actually about this boy band that he was producing, and it was strange at the time, and just like Payne said, like going and looking at all this archive video clips and then hearing him talk, he does seem like he hasn't changed that much about some of his ambitions, about just the way he approaches the case. He's very calculated, smart guy. He does like to control the conversation, and you'll hear some of that in episode 5.
How does he try to control the conversation? Is there something where he tries to he won't answer questions, or does he just try to steer you a certain way and you can kind of consistently feel that drive coming from him?
It's like when you talk to somebody and they just do most of the talking, and you don't really have a time gap to get in your question or to make a comment, and you have to really be on the ball to be able to get what you want out of the conversation. It's kind of like that. Right. He likes to talk a lot, and he likes to talk a lot about his story, and it's very interesting. And one of the parts of this podcast that I think listeners will like is that we're going to explore Wayne Williams as a person too. You'll get to kind of make your own assessment of who this person is. You tell me what you think about this person with all the personal, candid stories he's telling me. Not everything was about, did you do it? Obviously, I asked those questions too. But a lot of, building to that was having conversations and learning what kind of person this was. And I think that's kind of been one of the biggest mysteries too, is one, who's capable of doing something like this? Is it this man? And if it is, what is he like? Does he give that vibe off to me? And obviously that's not evidence, but I think for a lot of people, they want to know more. And one of those things is to know more about Wayne Williams, if he did it or not. And that's what we explore.
One of the things we've touched on this a little bit, but one of the really fascinating parts of this story is the disparity between the community and law enforcement, and how that in many ways has led to the belief in Wayne Williams's innocence or guilt. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, at one point you're interviewing someone who says that a lot of people in the community believe that this could be the work of the Klan, because the Klan wasn't that far removed, both chronologically and I think geographically, from Atlanta at the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's evidence there. I mean, the FBI investigated and wiretapped and was investigating Klan involvement. And the theory is that once if you believe the Klan was involved, it's convenient that they were not, right? So that's the theory. So there's no hard evidence pointing to that, but sometimes there is no evidence because that's not where they wanted to point. So that would be one of the conspiracy theories that are out there. But yeah, there's this real split, and I think anytime you're dealing with something racial, there's a split. And I think what we have to really try to do is come together and find a middle ground where we can start a conversation. So if you're way over here and you think Wayne Williams is innocent, and you're over here and you think he's guilty, there's actually more in common that we have, because when you really get down to having a conversation with someone who thinks one way or another, and I say, hey, okay, if you think he's guilty, which ones is he guilty of? We're talking about 30 kids here. They said, well, maybe not all of them, but some. ask the same questions to the people who say, "Oh no, he's innocent. He's not the Atlanta child murderer." Okay, well, what about these? What about the adults? Well, he might have done those. Okay, well, there's a middle ground to start a conversation on. And if we took that approach with all other issues instead of just automatically lining up on one side or the other and then
Politics,
fighting, yeah,
the memo, yeah, we could probably be pretty good on that.
So I think that's one of the goals with the podcast is look, let's create this middle ground, this gray area we can all sit in and start from there and begin a conversation. And I think we've done that so far.
Yeah. Now, both of you, just backtrack a little bit about the two of you as we're nearing the end of this. That doesn't make any sense. But neither of you have a history in true crime, really. You are a documentary filmmaker and you've directed some music videos, and you've worked in the music industry for some time with incredible talent. How did the two of you come together to start this?
To be honest, I was just tired of doing what I was doing.
Yeah.
I didn't want to do music videos anymore. I was over it. I got into doing music videos because I wanted to be a film director. I wanted to make movies. But you don't just go start making movies and be able to pay your rent. So I was a freelance filmmaker. I was doing commercials and music videos. And I actually met him because he managed a couple big artists who I did a bunch of videos for. You basically paid my bills for a while. Thank you. But I was watching The Jinx by Mark Smerling and about Robert Durst, the HBO series. And I binged it in like one day. And I was always just a fan of true crime as a viewer, listener, a big fan of Serial too. And I was like, why am I not making one of these? Like, that was the literal thought, was like, why am I not doing that? I could do that. I like doing that. I'm just going to do that now. And so I literally Googled a case. And some people make fun of me because of this. It's like, oh, you just Googled a case? I'm like, yeah, I just Googled a case. How would you find one? Yeah. So I Googled a case, and I found a case that was close enough to me. Just so happened that my grandma is basically from the town near there. Her best friend saw Tara the night she went missing. All these dots just began connecting. And I said, you know what? I'm going to investigate this story, and I'm going to make a podcast. And if the podcast works, then I'll make a documentary TV project on this. And that's what we're doing now, too. Mm-hmm. And so I just...
You're making a documentary TV project on the Atlanta Monster or on another
on
case?
Up and Vanished.
On Up and Vanished.
Yes, so that's going to be a TV series now. Mm-hmm. We'll go into other small towns that have unsolved disappearances and try to figure out what happened.
Yeah.
Just as these
so
rogue
not just Tara
amateur
Grimstead, you're doing
yeah,
multiple.
We'll cover that story as well, and then week by week take on different cases. This is like just not the way you would write the beginning of this story. When he was burnt out of making music videos, I was burnt out of the music industry itself, and we had been creating content together for years, 3-4 years. So we had a relationship already where when he told me what he wanted to do, I said, look, sign me up. And then he went and did the investigation, and it was like 6 months later he called me back and said, okay, remember that thing I told you about? I'm ready to do it now, but instead of a documentary film, let's do it as a podcast first. I said, hey, I'm ready. I need something new to put my energy towards. And I knew that.
Wait, you just need microphones? You don't need cameras?
Exactly,
Go ahead.
Yeah. I have to deal with artists.
Like budget $100. I was like, perfect.
But it was just, it's just not the way you would think that this story would start. It's really both of us kind of reinventing ourselves, and then in 18 months having 2 #1 podcasts over, closing on 200 million downloads between just the ones that we put out so far. So it's just a crazy story of how we got here, and I think it should really be something we talk about with other people. Whatever you're doing right now isn't necessarily what you're going to be doing in 18 months. We wouldn't have known that we'd be here. So, we just took a chance on something else and tried something new, and now we're here talking to you.
Was there a worry going into Atlanta Monster following the success of Up and Vanished and what happened? Definitely. Was there a worry of like, well, this just might be a case that we cover. No one's gonna. We're never gonna get someone to call in and pull out a confession again.
Yeah, I was like, oh shit. I set the bar way too high for myself.
That's like Steven Soderbergh winning the Oscar for his first movie. It's like, well, I'm done now.
It's like I got too lucky on that one. Yeah. But no, seriously, I thought about all those things. I was like, oh man, everyone's gonna be like, oh yeah, it's good, but it's not as good as the last one. That's what everyone always says. Right. I say that. So I put a lot of work into making it, in my opinion, better. From production value to the interviews to just the deeper themes this explores. Up and Vanished was more of just a real-time investigation where I was kind of really in the story, and it was just bizarre things were going on with this discussion board and me interacting with some of these suspects and just bizarre stuff. This is more of a story where I kind of take a step back and let these people who were around back then tell these stories and go try to find all the pieces we need to tell a story that's bigger than just true crime, but something that could, bring some people together today and find some common ground between black and white. And this story has, racial divide all within it. And there's so many things to learn from it. It's very important, I think, to retell this in a way that resonates with people like me who had never heard of it, and people who were around back then who may have remembered it differently or didn't know that this was what was really going on.
I think one of the things that you did really well going into Atlanta Monster was, instead of finding something that needed to be solved and a whodunit, you found something that was just in itself a fascinating story that people, once you start listening, you go, oh, I should know about this. I have to know about this.
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, the bar was set, like you said, very high with Up and Vanished, but there were so many ways that we could win with Atlanta Monster just by exposing it to people. That was a win in itself. So it wasn't that, hey, we have to solve 30 murders now instead of a disappearance. It was, look, we need to educate the public. We need to have people asking themselves, why don't I know about this? How was 1980 versus today? And the craziest thing is when we look back at 1980 and what was going on, I look back and I say, look, we've made a lot of progress, but not a lot of change, actually. So how did people feel about each other in 1980, and how do they feel about each other now? You don't see much difference. So you see difference in legislation and policy, but you don't see a lot of difference in like how much we've changed in our minds and our hearts about each other, and that's actually pretty scary.
Let's get some questions from the audience. Who has a question? Right here.
Hi. So I was wondering, how do you go into when you're interviewing somebody or without having a bias? I know, like in journalism, sometimes you're not supposed to. You have to be objective. But do you feel like you have already a mindset or expectations when you're talking to people of what they're gonna say?
You try not to. I usually stay down the middle on purpose.
At least try to hide it.
Yeah, my whole thing is that let them do the talking. I try to talk less, ask questions that are open-ended, and get a discussion going. Get them talking about something. Because even if you have a preconceived notion that you're not sharing with them, that you just feel partial about an idea or your morals are tugging you one way, they may tell you a story that makes you feel otherwise, and if you just let them talk. So I try to let them talk and not really insert myself into what they're saying, and take what they say and put that out there, and just try to be very tactful when you're doing it, basically.
Next question.
Hey guys, as creatives in this business, oftentimes I myself find a huge challenge between alienating a lot of your audience. When you bring something like this, as you stated, it only affected Black families. Therefore, what are the challenges and how do you really solve them by not even the same gatekeepers to pay attention to your content and to push it to different medias and platforms so you have the audience of not just Black communities, but everyone in mass media in general?
Yeah, I think we don't rely on the same forms of media that we did, when this case was breaking. And I mean, Atlanta, WSB and AJC, they covered this extensively, and I think they were pretty fair in their coverage. I think the difference nowadays is that, you can go create a podcast and the audience is there. It's about, can you market that audience, put it in front of enough people, and then the demand, if you create the demand, people will listen, and now you have a voice. So we can make noise as a community and as citizens that will make people pay attention. So while no one was talking about this case, 6 months ago, 2 months ago, they're talking about it now because we created content. No one was in our way. We didn't have to go to CNN or anyone else and say, hey, please cover this. We did it ourselves, made it big, and now we're forcing people to have the conversation. So I think that's the difference nowadays. You can just create it yourself and push it.
The cool thing is, too, is that we're not a big news station. We don't have a big agenda that we're pushing. there's black people and white people, people of all walks of life working on this project with Tenderfoot and How Stuff Works. So there's a bunch of different mindsets and backstories going into this. And so we're trying to make a podcast that resonates with everybody. It's not for one particular type of person. It's for all demographics. And I think that with all these, minds coming together, we can make something that's well-rounded and everyone wants to listen to. And that's, with that stage, you can do a lot. And you can bring a lot of people together.
And I think the podcasting medium is there. Like the true crime audience that's reads books or TV, they're engaged. But the podcast audience, there's no better audience to start something small and let it grow into like a huge blazing fire and be like the #1 story that people are talking about, because it's such a personal experience. It's just you and your earbuds, and you're listening to this thing, and you just want to know who else is out here. So you're on social media talking about it, you're at work talking about it, and it really spreads from word of mouth. And we're trying to actually bring more marketing and things to the podcast industry. We're doing billboards for Atlanta Monster in Atlanta. We're running TV commercials, just things that most podcasts aren't doing, because I think it should be put on the same level as television. And because the product that we're putting out, it's going to sound as good as something looks and sounds on TV. So that's our goal. The quality shouldn't shrink because of the medium that you decide to release it in. So we want to make high quality stuff and promote it at the same level of the product that we're making.
It's such an interesting time for true crime because after the success of The Jinx or Making of a Murderer, people are like, oh, true crime is really in right now. And I'd be like, no, true crime has always been in. Everybody has always loved crime stories. What's in now is like well done true crime stories. It was always tacky true crime stories that we watched on like A&E or 2020, that were like as salacious as possible. Suddenly people actually care about like the real dynamics and what's between the lines when it comes to these crime stories, which you guys are doing wonderfully and tapping into.
Yeah,
I think I have time for one more question. It wasn't even a question, sorry.
Hi. I was wondering, what tips do you have for people who want to start podcasts?
Well, the first one is just do it, because you're like, oh, great, thanks. But seriously, and I say that because I was this close to not doing it because I thought my voice sucked. I really did. I still don't love it, but I was like, I don't have that radio kind of thing. I just sound kind of stupid. And I almost didn't do it because of that. And now, I'm like, wow, I almost didn't do that because of that. It's crazy. But
the best way to deal with hating your voice is having to edit your own voice, because at that point you don't even have to pay attention to what it sounds like. You're just like, got to put the product together.
So I was doing that too. I was editing something. I did everything. I came up with what I thought was a great name and a great case and a great story, and just started infiltrating this community and started piecing it together. I didn't really have a formula for how podcasts were made. I'd only heard a couple at that point. I was a huge fan of Serial. I was inspired by Serial, but I didn't really like all the podcasts that were out there. And so I wanted to make something that I wanted to listen to. And all I really knew how to do was to make these sort of highly sort of produced, just the audio that puts you there. Like these sound design, different layers to it, and just almost like a cinematic experience. And so that's what I came from, is what I thought I was good enough at doing. And so I kind of just made my own thing. The thing with podcasts right now, there's no rules. You can do whatever. There's going to be there's another me right now who's about to just outdo everything that we've done so far. And I know that's coming up, so I'm trying to be on the next thing. And it could be you, seriously. Anyone can do it. I had no money. I was broke. I had no experience making podcasts, but I have 2 #1 podcasts in less than 2 years now, and that's only because I gave it a shot. And I never thought I'd be a podcaster. I still don't even label myself as a podcaster. I think that's kind of a term that shouldn't really be used like it is, because it almost deterred me in the beginning. I was like, well, I'm not a podcaster, so I can't make a podcast. Well, you're a podcaster once you make a podcast. So I would just say, just do it. There's information out there that you can look up, that all the technical stuff to help you out. But just find a great story and just tell a great story. And spend a lot of time making it sound good. that's the number one thing. If people like the way it sounds, people will listen to it.
It's also not hard. I mean, like imagine trying to get into acting or the music industry. It's everything is a lot harder than it is to just make a podcast. And it takes a microphone and an idea. So all you gotta do is try it, and you'll be able to listen to it. Your friends will be able to listen to it before you have to actually go put it out there. So yeah, bottom line, just go try something and research the field, figure out what you like, what's going to make your thing different than this other thing. And if you do listen to other podcasts, don't listen to them as within the confines of this is how I have to do it. Just know what you like and then make something that you want to listen to.
And take your time, too. I worked on Up and Vanish for almost 8 months
9
before I
months
did
or so?
anything. My friends were like, do you still have a job? I'm like, yeah, I'm working on this podcast that no one's ever heard of. But that's what I was doing for like 8 months. And I was, I wanted it to be really great. Now, don't be too much of a perfectionist where you just never put something out. That's a bad thing. But treat it like it's your only shot and just make it great. And if it's great, people will like it. That's the way it works.
Guys, congratulations on both podcasts. I'm looking forward to episode 5 that's coming out this Friday,
Thanks, man.
and the rest of them. I love it. It's incredible work. Everybody give them a round of applause. Download Atlanta Monster
Thank you.
and
Thanks,
Up and
guys.
Vanished on iTunes.
Appreciate it.